There's a general notion that the customer is king, but does this really apply to the relationship between landlord and tenants in Nigeria? Is the tenant really king when you look at the landlord tenant relationship in Nigeria? Welcome to the Property Hustle. Well, in today's episode, this episode 8 already, I want to talk about why landlords should think like a business owner, like a business person. Because, like I opened this talk with, the customers are always king, right? And so if landlords are able to take the rental, relationships between them and the tenants as a business, it helps to, create a better relationship. You know, in one of my previous episodes, I introduced a framework called the rent renewal test that helps to make tenants more responsible and helps them to plan better, rent well and become more better tenants, for themselves, for the landlords, for the general housing market. Do you understand? So, and I was now thinking that okay, if I'm talking about how the tenants can be better tenants, how can they plan ahead on time and plan properly so that they can renew their rent, they can live responsibly, they can be able to take care of themselves. Now, how can landlord help in this situation? Because at the end of the day, even though we are talking about tenants living better and being able to renew their rent, at the end of the day, the landlords have a role to play in that. Because sometimes you see some tenants, they are very good tenants until something happens. And one of the things that could happen and turn people off, turn tenants off to become bad tenants, is when they see that the landlord is not forthcoming in doing what they are supposed to do, or the landlord is not trying to be a good landlord. Because at the end of the day, it should be a case whereby everybody is trying to be better. You understand? And so, in that thinking that I was, having of how can the landlords become, more responsible, more better landlords, because at the end of the day, I believe that a better landlord is, good business. You understand? So I was now thinking, how can that happen? And which is what actually brought me, or brings me to this topic that I'm dealing with, or that this conversation today in this episode of why landlords need to think like business owners. So I now realize that for landlords to be better, to become better, it helps that they think like a business owner. Just like my introduction, where I talked about like customers being kings in every business, as at least as we know it in Nigeria. So now in the relationship between landlord and tenants, and of course we know that in that relationship the tenant is the customer, and while the landlord is the business owner, which is how it's supposed to be, and which is what I'm thinking it should be, right? So the tenants need to be treated as a customer, just like every business owner would like to treat their customers, right? You have the business owner will have to be courteous, will have to try to build and sustain a good relationship with their customers. Just like now, in that sense, the landlords needs to build and sustain good relationship with their tenants, so that by doing that, the tenant is able to do their own part. The tenant is able to take care of your assets. You understand? Just like you see that the hotel business, the hotel people, they have structures, they have buildings, but that building is not the business they are running. It's the accommodation that they provide for people. You understand? So as a landlord too, your business is not the building. The building is not your business. You can build 20 houses. That is not your business. Your business is the provision of the accommodations, is the rental that is the business. And so that is why there is need to think like a business owner, so that at the end of the day, it helps us to generally have a good experience, a better experience, because the whole idea is let all the stakeholders do what they are supposed to do, so that the housing market becomes more sustainable for everybody. You understand? Because if you look at it now, if your house is vacant, that means that you are losing money. You understand? As a landlord, if your house is vacant, you are losing money. And so what you would want is that your house should always be occupied. And so, and the only way and the best way to do that is when you run this business as a business. You understand? When you run it, factoring in the business, the relationship, the assets maintenance and all of that. You understand? So that at the end of the day, it now provides maximum return on your investment. So you wouldn't want the accommodation to be vacant. If it's vacant for 2 months, 3 months, you are losing money. And that's why you see sometimes you see a landlord will just come, they just want to increase the rent, they increase it arbitrarily, and most of the tenants, maybe some tenants rather, they are not able to afford this accommodation. And in most cases, all these increases, it's not like it's increased in such a way that the tenants even have a say. The tenants cannot even negotiate. It's just a case of, okay, this is my rent, this is my new rent. If you cannot pay, go. You understand? So I think there's need for some of those changes too, so that even when a landlord is increasing rent, there is need to make it an open something, so that the tenants can feel free to negotiate, and there's need to be considerate generally. You understand? So that is what I'm just saying in this, is that so that when you say, okay, this rent you have increased it, there's no room to negotiate, and the tenant leaves, maybe in the next couple of months the house is vacant, what you are doing is you are losing money. And then maybe at the end of the day, before the next tenant comes, you might have, the house might have stayed long in the market, and then you decide to reduce the price, and maybe the increase that you envisaged, that you wanted to even increase in the first instance, you might end up not collecting as much as that. You understand? Meanwhile, you might have chased out a good tenant. And what is there is the person that is coming that is ready to pay higher is not necessarily the best tenant. You understand? So the fact that a tenant is able to pay a higher rate as you set it doesn't mean that that is the best tenant that you have. Sometimes people pay the first rent is usually the easiest ones to pay. So sometimes they pay very easily that, but to renew becomes a problem. You begin to have personal, beef and problems with the tenant. You get it down. So that is why there is need to think like a business owner, so that it helps you to build better relationships. It helps you to consider the plight of the other people that are coming into your house, because at the end of the day, the fact that these people are tenants today, that does not mean that they are going to continue to live as tenants forever. So a time is going to come that they also are going to become landlords, and the lessons they are picking from you now, that is the landlord today, can influence how they treat other tenants that they are going to have tomorrow. And so it's now a duty that you have as a landlord to now begin to lay a good example. You understand? To lay a good example, to set a good example for your tenants, because tomorrow they are also going to be landlords. You understand? And so that brings me to the point where I also want to talk about the relationship between the landlord and the tenants. Most landlords, they see the tenant as the bad guys, but it's not usually the case. You understand? Just like it's not usually the case that most that is all landlords that are bad. So it's good that that relationship, just like you approach your relationship with your customers with open mind, it's good that you should also approach your relationship with your tenant with open mind, so that at the end of the day, we build this better relationship. And then again, we talk about maintenance. Like I said earlier, your building is the asset, is not the business, right? So most of the landlord, they think that doing maintenance, maintaining their house is money leaving their pocket. But meanwhile, at the end of the day, that is not the case. Doing maintenance, if you are thinking as a business owner, as a landlord, you are thinking as a business owner, you'll see doing maintenance as you improving the value of your asset. Like taking care of your asset, because it's still your asset. Tenants will come and go, but your building, which is your asset, remains. And so maintaining your house is something that should be seen as you adding value to your asset. And so by just doing that, thinking in that way, as you are thinking of it as a business owner, but it has a very, very positive impact on the tenant. It has a very positive impact on the housing industry, on the housing market. Because the tenant now sees that you are forthcoming with doing maintenance, and he wants to stay loyal to you. When it comes to doing maintenance, he's loyal. He just wants to make sure that he doesn't have any problem with you, because he sees that you are coming, you are forthcoming with your own end of the bargain. You understand? And so even in terms of maintaining your house too, the tenant will be, very, very willing to just make sure that the environment is clean, the inside of the house, if there's any minor maintenance to be done, that he's up and doing, trying to do it, so that at the end of the day, your assets is also maintained. So if you are forthcoming with doing the major maintenance that you're supposed to do, the tenants will be loyal enough to do the minor maintenance that they are supposed to do. So, and this comes down to you thinking like a business owner, as a landlord. You understand? So, like I said, that is what I was thinking. So, while I thought about, okay, how can the tenants be good tenants? And I thought around it, developed the framework of, the rent renewal test, and, talking about how they can plan and all of that, and become better tenants. It's also good that we have better landlords, because I believe that better landlords is also good business. And being a landlord is not just about the house, owning the house and collecting the rent and all of that. is also the business of it, because building a house is not something that is a very small financial investment. You are committing a lot of money to it, and I believe that a lot of people that commit money into building a house are expecting a return on their investment. And so being a good landlord, it goes beyond just you being jovial to your tenant, and being easy going, considerate, and all that. It also helps you to achieve your aim, your objective, you understand, of having or generating maximum return on your investment. You understand? So that is why I said that at the end of the day, it is not just going to be about all that one. It's going to be about thinking like a business owner. So I believe that just like the tenants, being better is good for the industry. For a landlord, being better is also very, very excellent for the industry. And that is why I, focused this episode on why the landlords needs to think like a business owner. Because if that happens, the landlord is going to consider the tenant as his customers, or as his customer. You understand? If it happens like that, the landlord is going to consider the tenant as his customer, and he's going to treat the tenant well. And the tenant is going to reciprocate, and then we'll now have good relationship. And once we have good relationship, it encourages you as a landlord to build more houses, because you are able to get more return. Like you get maximum return on your investment, and that helps you to have enough money to commit into building another accommodation. And then it helps the rental market generally. It helps us to provide more houses, and then by providing more houses, it means we have the cost of accommodation coming down gradually. Because at the end of the day, in the business environment generally, you have, the forces of demand and supply that, for some reasons, rents can decline, can decrease. You understand, from time to time, even, but in this part of the world, in Nigeria, it just happened that you don't have that kind of situation whereby you say that, okay, rent is reducing maybe in this so season. No, no matter whatever that happened now today, maybe something happened in Abuja today or something happened in Nigeria today, there's nothing that is going to make the landlords or the rent to reduce. And so we need to get to that level whereby the law of demand and supply, the market forces, can actually affect the rent, so that people can live better. You understand? So that the housing market, the housing industry, it be better for everybody. That the shortage of accommodation we're talking about, it can be improved. You understand? Because being a good landlord means that the tenants are also going to be responsible to you, just like I talked about being a tenant. So you need to play your own part as the landlord in helping to make sure in helping to make sure that the tenants are responsible, that the tenants are good tenants. Because in a situation whereby we have tenants complaining, we have landlords complaining, and everybody is blaming everybody, then we have a very, 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 very big problem. And if this episode helps you to think differently about the renting of accommodation that you do to the tenants, if it makes you to think about it in a different form, you know, please share it with somebody that might need to hear this. That the tenants can be treated better, and the housing industry can benefit more from it. And I'll see you in the next one.